This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern, and every week my co-host Dalia Shendlin and I talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Dalia is away this week, and therefore it is my pleasure, and mine only, to welcome Shmuel Rosner to the show. He's a journalist, editor, and senior research fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. His book, Israeli Judaism, which he co-authored with statistician and pollster Professor Camil Fuchs, has just been published in English. Shmuel Rosner, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, and say hello to Dalia for me.
I'm sure she's listening right now. So I'd like to start by unpacking the title of the study, Israeli Judaism. By virtue of being the Jewish state, every aspect of life here in Israel is Jewish in one way or another. And the early Zionists famously yearned for Jewish thieves and Jewish prostitutes. So can you tell us how you set about to define the object of your study, what Israeli Judaism is?
Well, first of all, the name of the book, Israeli Judaism, refers to a type of Judaism that we believe is the most common in Israel today. There are Israelis, Jewish Israelis, who still practice a type of old Judaism that's not really Israeli, or people who come from abroad and still practice Judaism from other places that is not really Israeli. Israeli Judaism is something that's unique to this time and this place. And this is what we refer to in the headline. The beginning of the study of this research really started from a question that we had about the culture of this place. This is a fairly young creation, the state of Israel. We started the study when Israel was 70, and we thought that that was a time long enough for us to look into the country and see if its culture is indeed unique. But Israel is also young enough, so everything is still new and not completely researched. And we identified a field that we thought was under-researched. And that is a very detailed examination of the way Israeli Judaism ticks. And we did this by really asking hundreds of questions. We surveyed thousands of people by using, statistical models, for which I needed Professor Fuchs. I cannot do any math, but he can do the math and I can do the writing.
As you say in the book, you are a man of words and he's a man of numbers. So the match was...
So when he was doing his magic on the Excel sheets, I was clapping. And then when we started looking at the thousands of sheets of data that we got, we could portray Israeli Judaism, I believe, with somewhat more nuance than ever before.
The interesting thing about Israel's existence, 70 years, is, as you say, it's a very short period of time compared to the long history of Judaism. But yet, there are some changes and meanders in what is Israeli Judaism from the early days until today. As you write in the book, and I quote, you observe Israeli Judaism as a solution to the crisis of Judaism in the 21st century, as one of the definitions that you take. So how is this crisis different from the crisis of Judaism in the 20th century that led to Israeli Judaism in its former iteration?
Well, the crisis of the 21st century truly began at the end of the 18th, at the beginning of the 19th century. It is still the same crisis that's been going on. With modernity, with emancipation, with the erosion of traditions among Jews and the erosion of beliefs among Jews, we needed to create some solutions. We needed to come up with ways to keep Judaism alive in a new era. Now, this is not something that happened for us in the first time at the end of the 18th century. It happened in year 70 when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. The Jewish people, by having such long history, needed to overcome all kinds of obstacles, one of which was this obstacle of modernity, secularism, assimilation, and all other things that we know from the modern world. And indeed, Israel provided one such solution to the problem. I tend to believe that, at least for now, it seems to be the most valid or the most robust solution to the problem, because we do know that Judaism abroad is has its difficulties with assimilation and birth rates, etc. And we know that Orthodoxy, while being a wonderful solution, only attracts a small fraction of the Jewish people. And we know that Reform Judaism, another type of solution, also has its problems. So Israel provided one formula to overcome these challenges. And what we do in the book, at least in the first part of the book, is to show in what way Israel enables us to overcome these challenges. I'll give just one example: assimilation. There is no such thing in Israel. Doesn't exist.
Yeah.
When we go to Israelis and give them a scale from 0 to 10 or from 1 to 10 and ask them, how confident are you that your children, and then we ask about grandchildren, will be Jewish, a majority of them not just give a positive answer, a majority of them give it a 10, which means no concern, we see no other option. What else is there? If they were born Jewish and they live in Israel, there's nothing else for them. So this challenge of assimilation, again, this is one example, is something that Israel could overcome quite easily and without much precedence in the last 2,000 years of Jewish existence.
But still, there is a difference between contemporary Israeli Judaism and the Israeli Judaism of 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. Can you qualify really about how that progression has played out?
Well, the founders of the state were atheist, secular, socialist, Jews. They were rebels. They rebelled against the Judaism of diaspora, the Judaism of submission to halakha, to Jewish law. They rebelled against the rabbis and the old practices. So the beginning of Israel was pretty much, an attempt to create what they used to call the new Jew. But as some of the early Zionists predicted, Judaism is strong, it's robust. You cannot easily run away from it. So with time, Judaism became less of a threat because it was no longer identified with, diaspora weaknesses of the past. And Jewish culture became a major part and a major player in Israeli culture today. So just one example, we tested Israeli music. Most Israeli Jews listen to Israeli music, namely pop music sang in Hebrew. Hebrew is the language of the land. That's a pretty big deal. 200 years ago, there was no community in which people spoke Hebrew as their mother tongue. Today in Israel, this is what we do. Not just Jews, but there are many Arabs in Israel whose Hebrew is much, much better than the Hebrew of Jews who live elsewhere. So Hebrew is one component of this new and robust Israeli Judaism, and there are many other elements. There are Jewish and Israeli holidays that we celebrate and become, one of the findings that we had. And this came by as we were running, experiments with the numbers. We were running statistical models and we're trying to find the exact model that fits the picture that we'd like to see. And one of the things that we discovered is that in Israel, most Jews adhere to a culture that is basically a combination of two things. It's Jewish tradition and it's Israeli nationality. You take them both, you make them into one entity. And most Jews in Israel no longer instinctively separate between what is Jewishness and what is Israeliness. these two became one and the same.
Yeah, what you call Jewsraelis.
Exactly. In the English version, we call them Jewsraelis, and these are people, as a symbol of it, we say these are people who recite the Kiddush on Friday night and raise the flag on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Of course, it's not all Jewish Israelis, but we discovered that a clear majority,
55% of them,
Right.
more than all others combined.
more than all others combined, and we also see that the trend is towards there. We see a tendency of people from other groups to move towards this culture of Jewsraeliness.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of blurring between what is Israeli and what is Jewish, and much of what you're describing is here can be defined or perceived as a sort of banal Judaism, to borrow the term of Michael Billing, banal nationalism. Really, it's something, Judaism that's part of the furniture, and in a way that's what the Zionists sought to achieve. Like, for example, what you're saying about assimilation being a non-issue, right? I mean, it's by virtue of living here, assimilation is much less of a threat than it is elsewhere, and this kind of Israeli-ness was at least tried to be divorced or separate from religious practice and rituals. Yet, as you say, sociologically, many of those Jewsraelis still adhere to earlier forms of Jewishness, from, fasting on Yom Kippur to making Kiddush on a Friday. What does this say, do you think, about the success or lack thereof of the Zionist project?
Well, first of all, I think it's a huge success. You called it banal. I prefer to call it effortless Judaism. This is Judaism, and you're right. It's what we do. It's how we live. This is not something in which we need to invest a lot of thought or effort, or we need to be aware of it or invest money and time in it. This is just our everyday. This is what we call life. And of course, this has advantages and disadvantages. There are some advantages to a culture in which people must think long and hard. But on a practical level, we see that it works much better when people can just live their lives with the culture that is just part of it, being integrated into their lives. And as to your second part of the question, there were two parts. I'm not sure if you noticed it, but the second part about religiosity or religion, for most Israelis, practicing Judaism is not about religion, it's about tradition. In the book, and when I speak about the book, I make sure to emphasize that when I say Judaism, when I say people light Hanukkah candles, this is not about religion. It's about tradition, it's about culture, it's about heritage. They don't light candles on Hanukkah because the rabbis say they ought to do it, or because it's written in the Talmud. They light Hanukkah candles because, again, this is what everybody else does. This is the way we live.
But that's a rather simple example. What about fasting on Tisha B'Av? Right? I mean, it's supposed to commemorate the destruction of Jewish sovereignty, yet what's the point of doing it after the reconstruction of Jewish sovereignty?
Well, most Israelis think there is no point of doing it, and that's why we see that, when we compare the two major fasts, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, Yom Kippur is still a day that most Israelis observe. More than 60% of Jewish Israelis fast on Yom Kippur, which means that all religious Jews fast on Yom Kippur, but also many Masorti, traditional Israelis, and many secular Israelis also fast on Yom Kippur. They fast a full day or half a day, or they drink but don't eat. They have different variations of the fast. But when we look at a day like Tisha B'Av, and we discussed Tisha B'Av at length in the book because it's an interesting example. On Tisha B'Av, the only people who fast are religious Israelis, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, or all Orthodox Israelis. For traditional and secular Israelis, Tisha B'Av is something of the past. They see it as part of the religion and not as part of the living tradition. The living tradition is Passover, it's Yom Kippur, it's Hanukkah, it's Purim, it's dipping apple in honey on Rosh Hashanah. The two things that people do here at the highest level is having family dinner on Rosh Hashanah and celebrating the Seder on Passover night. 97% or so attend Rosh Hashanah meal and Seder night. And, ask yourself why. The answer is because if you don't do it, you will literally sit in the dark. There's nothing else to do. This is what everybody does. And that's why you see it in such high levels for all Jews in Israel. Now, you ask, is this the success of Zionism? Yes, Zionism had two goals. One is to save the Jews from, being physically harassed and harmed. And Israel is a fairly strong country and can defend itself, etc. So that's one part of the vision. And the second part was to save Judaism from being eroded to the level of not existing. And when you come to Israel and you see that 97% celebrate the Seder and 100% light Hanukkah candles and 97% have a family dinner on Rosh Hashanah night and more than 80% have a family dinner every Friday night, you realize that Judaism is pretty much alive.
Is it very different from diaspora communities? I mean, because the flip side of what you're saying is that few Israeli Jews who aren't religious, for example, go to synagogue on Saturday. I mean, which is something that you see a lot more in diaspora communities. I mean, is it just really saving Judaism or just reinventing it and adapting it to a changing reality?
Well, it's both. It's both. It is saving Judaism in the sense that you don't have this question of Jewish continuity. The question of Jewish continuity that people ask themselves for many generations and still ask in all diaspora communities is the question of whether the young generation will still go to a Seder night or will still light Hanukkah candles or will still care much about being Jewish. So these questions were eliminated by Israel. But Judaism in Israel is also different. It is different in the sense that, I already mentioned, it's a mixture of tradition and nationality, which means, for example, and again, we go into a long discussion about that in the book when we talk about Memorial Day for the fallen soldier. Is this a civil event that's just, quote-unquote, Israeli? Or is it a Jewish event? Well, let's look at the facts. Let's look at the way we mark this event. It begins on sundown, like all Jewish events. It begins in a ceremony near the Western Wall, the Kotel. It begins with the Kaddish. So it is very much, if you mark Memorial Day in Israel, and a vast majority of Jews in Israel do that, you cannot ignore the Jewish aspect of it. This is not just a civil day in which a secular civil country talks about its wars and its soldiers. It is a day in which we say that the people of Israel remember their soldiers. And clearly, when we say Bnei Israel or Am Israel, when we say Am Israel, we do not talk about Am Israel in the civil meaning of it, the citizens of Israel. We mean Am Israel in the generational sense. Am Israel since the sons of Jacob and up until today.
Well, what do you think are the implications for the Jewish people at large? I mean, is Israeli Judaism becoming the paradigm if it hasn't yet? Because if you look at Israel, I mean, in many ways, the goal of Zionism is about to be realized if it hasn't been yet, in the sense that in terms of numbers, Israel will be the epicenter of world Jewry. For the first time in history, there will be more. Pretty soon, if it hasn't happened yet, I'm not sure. Pretty soon, a majority of Jews in the world will live in Israel and not in the diaspora. Do you think that, what you describe in the book is really sort of a manual, if you can say that? world Jewry or Judaism in the larger sense is going?
No, I don't think it's a manual, and I don't think it can be a manual. Israeli Judaism works in one place, in Israel. It works for Jews who want to come here, live here, and practice their culture as an Israeli Jewish culture. It cannot work neither for French or German or Argentinian or American Jews, nor for Israelis who emigrate outside of Israel. Israelis who live in Palo Alto, California cannot practice Israeli Judaism. It doesn't work there.
Why not?
Because America doesn't go by the Jewish calendar. You don't get a day off on Shavuot. The whole country is not doing the same thing on Sukkot. It's a different place and different atmosphere, and Israeli Judaism works here. It does not work there. However, you're right that what I was writing is relevant, or so we believe, to Jews who live elsewhere because of two things. One, because Israel is indeed becoming the most important Jewish gathering in the world. It has a lot of power and influence, both materially and culturally. And to be a Jew in the world today, disregarding Israel is becoming almost impossible. I don't think you can be a serious Jew without understanding that there is Israel out there and that Israel is indeed the center.
And understanding how it works, not just that there is.
I think, Israel is the center of global Jewry. I think it is also important because the fact that Israel is becoming such a place and that its culture is becoming such culture is a problem in what we call Israel-diaspora relations. There are, at least, if we talk about the two main communities, Israel and the United States, these are two Jewish communities who go in different directions. They are becoming different, and this is, people talk a lot about the differences between Israel and diaspora, and they tend to focus on day-to-day politics. You don't accept Reform Jews, or you...
for the occupation,
against the occupation, for Trump, for Obama. It always goes back to the daily newspaper. What we say in the book is that the differences between these two communities are much more profound. And, it's a long-term challenge. How do you bridge the gap, the essential gap between a culture that is national in nature, like Israeli Judaism, and a culture that is much different in nature, like the one we see in the United States? The solution, or the way to overcome this challenge is not to say to Israelis, well, you should become more like Americans, or to say to Americans, well, you must become more like Israelis. This is not going to happen. Different circumstances, ignite different responses to current realities. So we are going to remain different. And the challenge for us is to find a common language, even though we are different.
I think that the main issue with Israeli Judaism that you mentioned briefly earlier, but it kind of got lost among our focus on the cultural dimension in the discussion, is that there is a public policy dimension to Israeli Judaism, as you say, that the calendar is Jewish, and that there's no public transport on Shabbat, and on Tisha B'Av all the businesses are closed.
And if you have a child who goes to school in Israel, he will have a Purim party.
Yeah.
So the question of whether, are we going to celebrate Purim? Do we wear a costume for Purim? Well, you must.
Yeah.
Because there is a celebration at school and you must participate.
So to what extent do you think, I'm hearing from you that this is really the main difference, that this is really the fundamental constitution of Israeli Judaism, that it's just because it is the practice of, the way the world works, in a way, and less so a cultural thing?
No, I think the main difference, the fundamental difference, is that this is a Jewish majority society. Because of that, you see a government that enacts laws and calendars that, correspond with Jewish culture. And you see all kinds of other activities and decisions taken by policymakers that correspond with Jewish sensitivities and traditions. But the fundamental fact is, we are all Jewish. Well, not all, but 75% of Israelis are Jewish, and having such majority culture is something that Jews forgot about for 2 millennia.
So, what does it mean for the remaining 25%? Not just the Arabs. I mean, but also, the people on the margin, as it were, people who came here because they had a Jewish grandparent and they were therefore eligible for Israeli citizenship by the law of return, but aren't and have never been Jewish. And, Jewish culture was completely foreign to them.
So the second group you mentioned is the easier one, because for most of these people, there will be a process of what we call sociological conversion. Even if they do not actively convert, they don't go to a rabbi and do this formal act of conversion to Judaism, the mere fact that they live here among Jews and send their children to Jewish schools, etc., within a generation of two, we can expect that most of them will practice some level of Jewish culture and will be part of this Jewish majority. As for the other minorities in Israel, and the large minority is the Arab Muslim minority, of course, we are talking about the challenge. It's a challenge for them. The real challenge for Arab Israelis is not because of Jewish culture. It's because of a national conflict that, of Israel and the Arab world that is not yet resolved and started many years ago. When this one is resolved, I don't think it's going to be very difficult to live as a Muslim person in Israel. But for now, yes, of course, it's a challenge. And we should be aware of it and sensitive to it. And we should make sure to understand that accepting and absorbing and embracing the minorities who live among us is one of the challenges that we as a majority group have in Israel.
I wanted to ask you one last methodological question, perhaps, but Camil Fuchs is the one in charge of the numbers and the statistics, so we'll not challenge you on that.
My wife calls him the man who got it right twice, because in the last 2 rounds of election, he was the pollster who got the numbers closest to the actual result of the election.
So he got it right 3 times.
He is a wonderful poll, one of the best.
So I'd like to ask you about the questionnaire. It consisted of dozens, if not hundreds of questions.
Oh, we have close to 400 questions.
How did you go about, coming up with his questions? What were really the issues that you thought were the main focus? How do you adapt it into questions, really?
Okay, so there were several stages of decisions that we had to make. And the first and I think most important decision was that our main focus is going to be practice and not views. In most polls, people tend to ask about views, and we wanted to draw a nuanced picture of what Israelis do rather than what they think. We have many questions about beliefs and about ideas, etc. But most of the questionnaire is devoted to actions. We started with the calendar. We started with Rosh Hashanah and said, okay, there's Rosh Hashanah. What do we want to know about Rosh Hashanah? Okay, do people dip apple in honey? Do they go to synagogue? Do they go to hear the shofar blow? Do they travel abroad on Rosh Hashanah? Do they see it as a regular day or as a special day? Do they celebrate only the first day of the holiday or also the second day? Do they have a family meal? So on Rosh Hashanah alone, we have 10 questions. Now, what comes after Rosh Hashanah?
Yom Kippur.
No? There's Tzom Gedalia, the fast of Gedalia.
Sorry.
Okay?
Shows you where I'm on your scale.
Okay, it's a marginal fast, but we wanted to know, are there Israelis who observe Tzom Gedalia? So we asked 2 or 3 questions about Tzom Gedalia. Then comes Yom Kippur. Again, 10 or 15 questions. Then Sukkot, the first day, the other days, Simchat Torah. We added many days that aren't part of the traditional Jewish calendar. The Memorial Day for the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Okay? Do people observe this day? What kind of people?
How do they observe them?
How do they observe it? Do they light a candle? Do they go to a rally? What do they do for Memorial Day for Yitzhak Rabin? So they're just going through the calendar. We had hundreds of questions. And then, there were questions about life cycle, bar mitzvah, brit, how people get married, how they divorce, and questions about beliefs. So I'll give you one example about beliefs. We had 2 rounds for this questionnaire, and in the first round, we asked, do you believe in God? And we got the simple answer that all polls in Israel get. It's approximately 80-20. 80% who believe in God and 20% who say they don't. And we say, okay, that's a simple question. Let's make it more interesting. So in the second round, we gave people 5 or 6 options. We started with, I fully believe in God, be'emunah shlema. I have no shred of doubt. Then another option, I believe in God, but sometimes I have doubts. Then there was a third option. Sometimes I believe in God and sometimes I don't. And then you have, I don't believe in God, but sometimes I do tend to think there is one. So by asking such, a more nuanced question, we got to see that the people who truly believe in God, well, it's 80% if you give them the binary option, yes or no. But those who truly believe with no shred of doubt, is about 56%. It goes down.
Which is still a lot.
Still a lot, right. That's true. But this was our goal, to search for places in which we can have a more nuanced picture.
Okay, and for the rest of it, our listeners will have to read the book, which I highly recommend. It's written in a language that's really accessible. I think that was
we were trying not to. It's not a numbers book. We try to make it
tell a story
into a narrative. Right?
Yeah, absolutely, and you've done well. Shmuel Rosner, thank you very much for coming in and discussing your new book, Israeli Judaism, that was co-authored with Professor Camil Fuchs. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And also many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, as well as the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review in the ratings and review section. A good one, I hope. And also you can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And you can follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.